Ability is what you are capable of doing. Motivation determines what you do. Attitude determines how well you do it. With that being said, a very good evening, everyone. I'm happy to welcome you all for the day 6 of 1 week faculty development program on nuances in writing research article. It's indeed a great pleasure to introduce the resource person for the day, Dr. Anupama Chirag, Associate Professor and Program Chair BBA at School of Business and Law, Navrachna University. She has been into academics for more than a decade and has contributed across wide areas of all-around development of students and institutes. She holds a PhD from Gujarat University, certified under UGC NET. She has pursued her MBA Marketing from Hemachandracharya North Gujarat University and Masters in Commerce from Gujarat University. Just not limiting herself to teaching, she has even contributed her knowledge in marketing domain through various research publications and presentations. She had received Best Paper Awards in various international conferences. She is a recipient of Young Woman Achiever Award Nirupama 2018 from Aishwarya College of Education, Udaipur, Rajasthan. Dr. Anupama has also penned 3 books in the area of her research. She is significantly associated with GTU as Doctoral Process Committee member, also acting as editorial board member for 2 reputed journals. Dr. Anupama is serving as the PhD guide for 2 students. She has been sharing her insights with faculties and industry associates with resource person at various universities. She has been rendering her services as subject expert and presenter for development of e-content for MOOC in the area of consumer behavior and branding. Thank you so much, ma'am, for accepting our invitation. You can take over the session, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you very much. I hope I'm audible. I hope I'm audible, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am, you're audible, ma'am.
Thank you. And I hope the screen is visible.
Yes, ma'am, it is visible. The PPT is now on stream, ma'am.
Okay, thank you very much, ma'am. So, thank you very much for that warm introduction. And I would like to welcome all the FDP participants to today's session, which is titled as Factor Analysis using SPSS. So, what I have done is like because this FDP is talking about writing research articles and various shades and meanings that we have to incorporate as a researcher when we talk about our research that we're taking up. I've divided this session into 3 major aspects. The first aspect that I'll be talking about is going to be factor analysis, the basics. The reason to divide these into 3 divisions is like because as a researcher, there we need to have an answer to why we are using particular analysis. So in this first section of my slide presentation, I will be talking about what are the different aspects and what are the different areas in which it is appropriate for a researcher to take up factor analysis as a tool for the research instrument that has been taken up by you. The second section of this PPT would be talking about factor analysis, the execution. So basically the process, the steps that are required when we have to perform factor analysis is second part that I will be taking up. And for the second part, I will be giving you some hands-on for on the SPSS window, or showing you what are the steps that are to be taken into consideration while we are trying to run factor analysis. The third and most important aspect which I would like to highlight and which completely correlates with the title of our FDP happens to be the reporting for factor analysis. That's the writing aspect. So that's the third thing that I would be looking at. So basically, this entire session is divided into 3 slots. First, we'll start with what factor analysis is, what are the reasons for which factor analysis should be undertaken. Second, we will be talking about what are the steps that are required while we execute on the process that we have to adapt while we are trying to undertake a factor analysis. And third, the most crucial aspect, how to report the outputs that have been from step number 2. So let us quickly move on. The first aspect of it, the basics. So when we talk about factor analysis, the common term, if you look at Google and if you search about factor analysis, one thing that you would Observe is that it's a tool that is being used to reduce the data. It's a data reduction technique, and the objective of data reduction can be defined into three major purposes. So basically, when we talk about factor analysis, it's a multivariate statistical approach. Now, what I mean by multivariate is that there are going to be many variables which I'm having in my DCI, that's data collection instrument, wherein I want to see that how these variables are interrelated to each other. Do they have some meaningful patterns? Is there any correlation that exists between these variables which I'm intending to measure or maybe looking at through my data collection instrument? So that's why factor analysis is also known as a multivariate statistical approach, basically used to reduce the data. Now, when I say data reduction, factor analysis comprises or maybe it helps us in serving three major purposes. Let's have a look at these purposes. The first purpose can be refining the measurement scale that we are using. So when I say measurement scale, I give you a hypothetical example to make you understand what do I mean by measurement scale. So it can be that you want to do some modification in the measurement scale that you are using in your DCI, that is data collection instrument. It can be that you're coming up with a new scale altogether. You want to bring in some modification, or maybe you're combining different scales which are already existing in the literature and want to use it in your research. So that is the first purpose with which researchers use factor analysis. The second reason, which is mostly quoted in literature, is like the scale that I've been using is validated in X situation, but then now I'm using the same scale with a new population, and I want to check that whether the same is valid to this new population or not. So the second reason why factor analysis is being commonly used is that you are using a scale to a new population, new geography, new type of target audience. So this could be the second reason why factor analysis should be accepted by a researcher. Third, and the most prominent, is because we want to give a validity argument for grouping the items together. So you would have heard about these terminologies multiple amount of times: content, validity, and reliability. So many a times, top tier journals or maybe good conferences or maybe people who are acting as experts or who are reviewing us, they ask us that what has the validity and reliability for the data collection instrument. Factor analysis can be one of the solutions to this question, which is being raised by journals or maybe during conferences. So when you want to prove that the scale that you are using is valid, again, factor analysis can play a vital role. Now here, I would like to talk about this aspect, data reduction technique. What do I mean by this? So have a look at this slide. Suppose say the data collection instrument that I'm having, I have identified 10 variables from different literatures, from say sources, through expert interviews. So from various sources, I have understood that there are 10 different things which has an influence on some aspect which I am trying to derive. Now I have titled labeled as B1 to B10. These items which are titled as B1 to B10 are being called out with different names, such as in few books you would see them being named as variables. There are few references where they say that they are the items which you are using to measure. There are few which wherein they are told as observed variable and measured variable. So I would like to take a minute in justifying what do I mean by observed variable and measured variable. These are the questions that we are going to ask to the sample to whom we are giving our questionnaire. These are those aspects which they are going to answer to. That's why they are even known as observed variable or measured variable. So now, where this factor analysis comes into picture. So as I told you, there are 10 set of things. This is because it's an hypothetical example, I'm showing you 10 of them. Maybe the list goes on to 50, 60, 72 or 100. So then it becomes very cumbersome to remember all these variables and see the relationships that exist. And that is where factor analysis plays a vital role. So what does factor analysis do? Factor analysis is a statistical technique which tries to check the intercorrelation among all the listed items or variables that are there in your data collection instruments. And based on the intercorrelations these variables have, it tries to group them into a common factor factor, a construct, or a unobserved variable. So this is how it works. So this is just for ease of understanding. I have drawn few arrows. Now what I'm trying to do through these arrows are V1 to V4. They have good intercorrelation. The same goes with V5 to V10. And then when we run factor analysis, we are able to give them some name. So as now I've labeled it as factor 1 and factor 2. So this is the basic purpose of factor analysis. So from 10 things that I have had, with the help of factor analysis, I could come up with two concrete things. And then I have valid reasons to say that why V1 to V4 are part of factor 1 and why V5 to V10 are part of factor 2. So that is the thing, or that is the process that factor analysis helps us with. So now, as I told you, something which is titled as B1 to B10, they are known as variables, items, observed variable, and measured variable. Factors, the name that you give, they are titled as factors, construct, latent variables in few of the books and web pages, and even unobserved variables. So this is the basic thing that is being done by factor analysis. But then when we go on to do it in a real life with research, it may not be as simple as that. And that's why we take aid of various softwares that are available in order to help us go through this entire process. So that's what we will be discussing. Now, when we talk about factor analysis can be classified into two major types. The first is exploratory factor analysis, and the second is the confirmatory factor analysis. And each of these factor analysis have different objectives to serve. Today, the session that I'm talking about doing factor analysis using SPSS, and that's why I am going to highlight and emphasize on EFA, which is the thing that you can do using SPSS. So let us look at the objectives of EFA. Why do we do EFA? So exploratory factor analysis can have these many objectives. Majority of them is what I showed you in the previous slide. Like it helps you reduce the variable. Now when you practically run a factor analysis, there can be few variables which do not fall into any of those factors. So maybe it would be ideal to remove variables or maybe reword such variables and then ask again. So there are several implications that the result of factor analysis EFA can give you. So it helps you support your decision making. It helps you check the validity of the instrument. That's point number 2. It helps you if there is any connect or any relationship between variables. So as in the previous slide I was showing you V1, 2, 3 and 4, they were loading on factor number 1. So that is showing a relationship, that there is a correlation between the first 4 variables and the last 6 were having correlation. That's why they were titled as factor number 2. EFA helps us in identifying or maybe looking at the constructs which can help us develop theories in future. But this is one of the most important reasons why EFAs should be run by researchers. So now let us go back to the term. It says exploratory factor analysis. So exploration. What do we mean by that? Discovery. So EFA actually is used by a researcher when he or she doesn't know, or maybe there is no literature evidences to talk about the relationship that exists between multiple constructs, and you want to discover and understand if there are any relationship. So that's the basic reason which EFA should be used by a researcher. This slide, or maybe this much aspect is very, very important because these reasons help you justify the tool that you as a researcher are using for your research techniques, and hence this slide, though it is theory, is very, very important for all of us to understand. Now, if exploratory factor analysis talks about discovery of variables or maybe the constructs or maybe the relationship with the constructs, what does CFA do? Confirmatory factor analysis, the word itself suggests confirmation. You're trying to get some results. You're trying to get some proof or evidences for what is already existing. So contrary to EFA, wherein the researcher might not be having much of information about the variables or underlying constructs, in confirmatory factor analysis, the researcher is already having an existing skill. or maybe he's already having a theory is already being proposed, and you as a researcher, when you are just aiming to check the relationship between the constructs that are there in the theory, at that point of time, CFA should be utilized. But when we talk about running CFA, it cannot be done on SPSS. Tools like MOS should be used, and hence this is out of purview for the discussion in today's session. So let us go ahead with understanding EFA. So as I told you, what is EFA? We are trying to discover all those variables and see if there are any meaningful patterns in terms of intercorrelations that exist between all the variables, so that we can group them together and give them a certain name or give them certain factor labels. So now, how to get started? Before we start, or maybe before we plan to do a factor analysis, as I told you, we should be very clear as to why are we running the factor analysis. So the answer to why has to be very clear, and this why could be one of the reasons which I mentioned to you in the previous slide. The second is, before we go on to SPS, obviously we need to have the data with us, right? So then creation of appropriate data collection instrument is also required. For example, in the second slide I showed you 1, 2, 3, 4 and till 10. Those V1 are not going to get analyzed in SPSS software. We need to have the list of variables that we are looking at. So our DCI should be developed properly, and when I say this data collection instrument variables, we can get it from literature sources, we can get it from secondary sources if it is available, and if we have good connections industry, it is highly recommended to go on and talk to industry experts and academic experts before we finalize DCI, because it gives us a relatively new perspective of the variables that we are measuring as a researcher. Now, once this has been done, our questionnaire is set, everything is done. The next step is gathering data. Now, gathering data means we are going to circulate our data collection instrument to samples. They are going to respond to it, and then we get back a list of 100 respondents, or 200, or 300, or 400, and so on. Now, the problem is like, always as a researcher, we are unsure about the required amount of samples that are required for factor analysis, or in that context, any of the tools that we are using, may it be regression, may it be or maybe whatever tool we are using, there has to be a reason, there has to be an appropriate justification to how many sample are being used by us to run the analysis. Now, let us have an idea about what is the sample size that is required when it comes to running factor analysis, especially EFA, that is exploratory factor analysis. So, when we talk about sample, like determination of whether I want 100, whether it should be 200, whether it should be 300, it should be 500, there are two major aspects to look at the sample size. So there are a lot of literature evidences actually, which talk about an exact sample size that should be selected to run a factor analysis. And there are second set of ideologies, second set of literature, which are talking about the proportion of sample to variable ratio. So I'm showing you the prominent literatures that exist for defining the sample size. Have a look at this table. So the first three that you see, they're talking about the adequate sample size required. So these are different literatures that are quoted, and I've specified that what each of these literatures are highlighting. I'll be sharing this slide later. You can check it for yourself, and even the references from where I've taken these figures are already there at the end as reference list. I would really request you all to go back to those PDFs and understand in detail how they have come up with these numbers. So this is what is for sample size. The second technique which I was showing over here, that is sample to variable ratio, is something which is more prominently practiced. So now what do I mean by variable ratio? Sample to variable ratio, that is NP ratio, where N is the number of participants required and P is the number of variables that I have. Okay, and again, as a rule of thumb, there are multiple authors who have given different type of ratios, but then out of all these ratios, it is 10 is to 1, which is prominently being used by researchers across. But then when you use any of these thumb rules, you have to justify it with adequate literature support. If you do so, you will be at a better position to justify your sampling number. So what do I mean by 10 is to 1? 10 is to 1 means if I have 5 items in my data collection instrument, 10 times should be the number of participants. So 5 into 10, 50 should be the sample size. So these are different literature evidences that exist as to determine what should be the adequate sample size. There are literatures which are putting both of them, but what I have observed over a period of time is more usage of NP ratio when it comes to factor analysis. So this is about the number of samples that we should be having. So now what is next? Like we already know the reason to run factor analysis. We have our data collection instrument ready. We have already figured out the number of samples that we need, and we started collecting the data. And now once you're done with this particular step, you would be having an Excel sheet with all the responses from the respondents from whom you have collected the data. So that brings us to an end of the first part wherein I wanted to talk about the basics. Now the next part, execution, that is how to run EFA in SPSS. So first what I'll do is I'll be showing you a few images in this PPT itself, and then I'll take you to SPSS window and quickly show you the steps that are required. Okay, so now this is how we get started. We go on to our SPSS window, and when we go on to SPSS window, this is the initial box, initial dialog box that will come up to you. What we do is we go on to Analyze tab, we click on Analyze type, and in that we go on to Dimension Reduction. I've already given you justification as to why dimension reduction, because factor analysis is a tool that helps you reduce the data. Data reduction technique is what factor analysis is. So when we click on this tab which says factor, this is the dialog box that opens up. And in this dialog box, there are 5 prominent aspects that we need to be very clear about while we begin our analysis. So which are those 5? These are the 5 aspects that are to be given importance to. Let us, I'll show you them one at a time. So when you click on the first tab, that is descriptive, this is the dialog box that opens. These are the which have already been checked by the system by itself. We will even check Kmo and Backlist Test. Along with that, this is also one window which I would want you to check. I'll tell you the reason why at the end when I talk about how to report factor analysis. So this is the dialog box that opens up when you press descriptive. Then next is extraction. You click on extraction, you see something called method, and it already has clicked on principal component. There are many different methods that you can adopt, but then there are 2 prominent ones which are highly used in social sciences and humanities, and the prominent one is PCA, that is principal component analysis. Then you have Analyze tab wherein you will click on Scree plot and unrotated factor solutions, and then you go to next. The next tab that opens up is rotation. Now in rotation, it will ask you which method of rotation do you prefer, and as you can see, there is a dialog box which is showing you 5 different types: Varimax, Direct Oblique, Quadric Max, Equimax, and Promax. But then out of all of them, Varimax is the most prominently used method, followed by the Direct Oblique, but then we stick to Varimax because that has more literature support. In the tab of scores, we don't click on any of the boxes because it doesn't bring any much of changes in the objective of the research we are undertaking. So scores you can click, or when you don't open it, that will be fine. Then we go to options. In options, this box has to be ticked, and this also has a very valid reason. I tell you why when I show you the output window. Okay, and when you press on continue and you press OK, obviously you get a output window. Now when you talk about output window, it will give you a series of tables, but then that tables are of no use until and unless you are able to interpret the results. So before we go on to interpreting the SPSS output, or maybe the tables that we get out of SPSS execution on after the steps, let us look at the steps manually, looking at the SPSS software. I'm stopping the sharing screen as of now. Madam, if you can just confirm, is the SPSS window visible?
Yes, ma'am. It's screening,
Okay,
ma'am. I have just opened it.
yeah. And please do confirm once it is done.
Ma'am?
Yes, ma'am.
Ma'am, yes,
Yes,
ma'am.
ma'am.
SPSS is on screen, ma'am.
Okay, thank you, ma'am. Thank you. So now, I'm
Thank
not
you,
going
ma'am.
to get into details of, yeah, thank you, ma'am. I'm not going to get into the detail of how to bring the variable view and data view, because then that consume a lot of time. So I've already prepared this SPSS window ready for you with all the data inputs that were required. So in variable view, I have inputted all the data, and in data view, I have all the responses that I have got for the questions that I asked. So if you look at this, I am having 33 variables in this tab that is visible on the right hand corner top. It says 33 variables. Okay, so let's follow the process. We go analyze, we go to dimension reduction, we go to factor. When I click on factor, this is the window that I had even shared in the PPT. Now I have actually kept only those variables which are required by me for this session, and only those all the 33 variables which I want. I press Ctrl A and I press on this button, this arrow, and it will bring all of them to this variables list. Okay. Now I press the first tab, that is descriptor. So when I go on to press descriptive, this is the dialog box that opens. I click on Kmo and Backlist Test of Spacity. I click on Reproduced. Okay. Then I say continue. I go on to extraction. Now, if you remember, I told you while I was explaining in the PPT, in methods, there are multiple methods that are available. So I'll just show you the dialog box. So these are the options. So the prominent ones that is being used mostly by the researcher happens to be principal component analysis, that is PCA, that is the one which is hitted. The second happens to be principal access factoring. These are the two methods that are most used, but then more than principal access factoring, it is PCA that is being used. The reason being that when we talk about principal component, all the variables under the study or research are being considered, and they try to show us relationship, interrelationship among all the variables, and then help us determine the factor. So because my objective is that, I'll go with principal component analysis. Now in Analyze tab, I see something called scree plot. It is a graphical representation of number of factors that are getting extracted. So now it is an outdated method to keep screen plot, but then if you are writing for your thesis, or maybe for research thesis at the master level, so then screen plot is also recommended. So that is what I will be picking up. I press continue. Then I have rotation. So in rotation, as I told you, there are many methods again. Varimax and direct oblimin, they are the two most used methods, but Varimax is the one which is the highest used. So that is one thing that you would be selecting. You again press on continue. In stores, we don't have much to do, so I'll just press continue. In options, this is very very important. In options tab, I click on this suppress small coefficients. So I click on this, and then now this dialog box has become active. So see, if I don't click on this, the dialog box was not opening up. When I click on this, the dialog box pops in. Now, in factor analysis, we consider all those factors whose values are above 0.50. Okay. Any values which are less than 0.50 are usually considered to be not in alignment with the model that we are testing, or maybe they are not considered to be useful for the research study. So then I'll fix it as 0.50 over here because that is what literature suggests. I press continue. Now I've ticked all the 5 things. I have opened all the dialog box and I have selected all the aspects that I wanted to run the factor analysis, and now I say OK. So now when I say OK, there is an output tab that gets generated. I hope the output tab is visible. Madam, I hope the output tab is visible. So the first result that we have here is Kmo and Backlist Test. Now, KMOs, I'll be talking about each of these tables one by one so that when I show you the reporting part, we can look at how it is to be written. So the first test that we look at is KMO and Backlist Test. Now, what does KMO predict? KMO predicts, it is a MSA tool. MSA stands for Measurement of Sampling Adequacy. Like at the end of this factor analysis, all your variables that you have put in, for example, I have put in 33 variables. Factor analysis is going to create constructs of factors. But then, are these variables having sufficient sampling adequacy? That is what KMO test suggests. So, if you look at KMO, the value that is visible over here is 0.933. The acceptable level, according to many of the literatures, is 0.50, but then 0.70 is what we should target structures. So KMO more than 0.70 is less than that. It means that the samples are not adequate to justify the factors that we have got through this entire process. The next aspect in the same thing that we need to report happens to be backlist test of sphericity. Now, as I told you in the second or third slide, I showed you V1 to V10, and then I was talking about that V1 to V4, they are together because their intercorrelation is high, and that's why we claim that they are, that is factor 1. V5 say V6, I claim that they are factor number 2 because they have intercorrelation. Backlist test of sphericity helps you understand the correlation level, and to check backlist of sphericity that we look at the significance level, and it should be less than 0.05. Okay, the significance level should be less than 0.05. If you look at my table, it is 0.000, that means it is less, and which means that my data is sufficient to run factor analysis. Both KMO and backlist test of sphericity are above the required levels, and hence I should proceed further with factor analysis. So this is the first table which we even need to report while we write about this in our research article. The next table is communalities. Now, communalities is a table which is not reported or presented in our research articles, but then this gives us a basic guideline of how do these variables uh, um, are presented in this research. Now, how to check that which of my variables is good or which of my variables is bad. So, in initial, you will see there is 111 everywhere. There is a table which is extraction. So look at the extraction value. Extraction value also should be greater than 0.50. If there is any variable which is having less amount of extraction value, you would observe that those variables are creating problem to you even when you look at which factor is loading where. Okay, so if you look at the data that I have presented here for those 33 variables, all the communalities are greater than 0.70. So there is 0.859, 751, 95, and so on. So there is 0.655, but it is also above 0.50. Okay, so you see all the communalities are higher than 0.50. So this is also one statement which needs to be reported while you write this in your research article, though the table is not to be represented. Now, if you remember the slide wherein I was showing you V1 to V10, then I was telling you that V1 to V5, V5 to V10 is factor 2. How do we get that in factor analysis? So this is the table that helps you understand, which is titled as Total Variances Explained. This is one of the most important tables because it will show you all the components that you had given as an input to this software, that is 1 to 33 in my case, and then it shows how many factors have been extracted by them. So if you see till 5 over here, there are numbers, and then the table is completely empty. So what is this table suggesting? This table is suggesting that five components, these 33 items have been grouped into five components based on the intercorrelationships that existed between each of these variables. So that is what the total variances explained table is denoting. Okay. Now, I would like to draw your attention to something titled as Eigen Value. So, how do they, accumulate all these things? So, the accumulation is being done on the basis of the totals of Eigen Value. Any component which is having the total of more than one Eigen Value is considered to be a part of factor. So, I would like to draw your attention to the second column, which is titled as total. If you see from sixth component, the eigenvalue is 0.717, then it is 0.669. So see, they have not taken those things, they have not considered. That means all those items are part of some or the other factor or construct. Okay, so total variances table has to be reported in your Word document. There are people who report the entire table, there are people who just report this till component 5. Okay, one more important aspect in total variances, it helps us identify two things. One, the number of components. So in my case, there are 5. The second is how much is this factor contributing. So if you look at the cumulative, the last column, you would observe 78.167. So these five components are having 8.167 percentage influence on whatsoever I'm trying to find out. So this is a good amount. There is a range for this also. I'll show it to you later with the literature support. So 78 percentage of variances in my research are explained through these five components. This is what this table is representing. The next is screen plot. This is just a graphical representation of this total variance explained. So if you see, I told about eigenvalue. That eigenvalue should be more than 1. So it shows the eigenvalues, the component-wise eigenvalue. So you will see that till 5, right? From 6, it is dropping down to 0, right? So till 5, it is having a higher eigenvalue, and that is what has been represented in the variances table. So it's a graphical representation of number of factors that are being identified by factor analysis. Then we have component matrix. Now, if you remember, while I took you to this analyze column, I'm just again going to this factor, and when I use this option, I clicked on this suppress small coefficient which is below 0.50. If you don't click on this, what will happen is you will get a table full of lot many digits, and then identifying that which item loads onto which component becomes very cumbersome and difficult, right? So when you click on that particular column and you mention that you only want those items which are having a load of more than 0.50, a presentation of this sort is available to you. So if you remember, I said that we have 5 components, and then it is showing which item is loading onto which component. We would be using this table, and for this table, this is the reproduced correlation. I'll talk about this at the end because we don't want to take anything from this table, but there is a statement that is important. We go on to check the rotated component matrix. Okay. And there are two tables here, component matrix and rotated component matrix. Rotated component matrix is going to be used by us to see which item loads onto which component. So for example, the first statement, it is very clear. It is not loading on 2, it is not loading on 3, it is not loading on 4, not on 5, it is loading on 1. The second statement is loading on fourth item. The third statement is loading on the first. So you will be able to see that which item is getting loaded onto which component, and then you can rearrange the entire table, and based on the similarities that you observe, you have to give it a factor name. Okay. Giving a factor name is again something wherein you can look back to your literature and get adequate support from the literature to justify that which like 5 factors are there, but how do I name them? What is the name that I'll be using? So this is going to be item wise. For all the 33 statements, I see that it is getting loaded on some or the other variable. Okay. So this is the output window that gets generated. Okay. Now I stop sharing this and go back to my PPT. Madam, please do confirm whether my PPT is visible. I'm on the slide interpreting the results, SPSS output.
Yes, ma'am. PPT is visible, ma'am.
Okay, thank you. So, this is what I already discussed while I was showing you the output windows. I will not waste much of the time. I'll very quickly go on to this. We saw Kmo, we talked about backlist test of scarcity. So I told you that it is talking about sampling adequacy. Backlist tests about whether there is a sufficient correlation between the variables that are grouped together. A Kmo value, it is always good to be better than 0.70, and this is from the literature. So whatsoever I'm talking, whatsoever are the numbers that I'm showing you here are coming from the literature, and these why I'm showing you this is because when we report all these things, if in brackets you are saying that there is a result and it is completely in alignment with the literature support by XYZ person, it makes your research look more concrete. So that is why literature support is very, very essential. Total variance is explained. So in our example that I showed you, there were 5 components that were coming up. So now there are papers which mentions that the total variance explained should be between 70 to 80 or 60 to 80. But then there is a literature which says that any total variance in humanities and social science, if it is between 50 to 60, it is good to justify the factor. Okay, so in my case it was above 70, and that means the total variance is explained was sufficient for the factor analysis that I was undertaking. So this is exactly what I showed you when I showed you the outputs, and all these things they are to be represented with table with justification of LR, that is the literature. You have to talk about the values and then talk about the analysis. You have to represent all these things in the interpretation writing that you do exploratory factors. So what we done is we have about the physics, we have about the execution. Now we come back to the major task, that is writing, which is the objective of this FDP. So when we talk about writing, factor analysis or per se any tool that you use, it is going to offer 2 major aspects of your research paper. One is the research method section, the methodology section, and the data analysis, obviously. So when we talk about research method section, you will as a researcher have to talk about what is the research design because of which you have to use EFA, okay, exploratory factor analysis. What has been the sample? Why these many samples were being chosen by you? What is the literature support that you have? Which data analysis tools have been used by you? What's the software that you have been using? For example, the SPSS version that I showed you, you even have to code that I've been using SPSS 20 and EFA. The same reciprocated analysis section and talking about your findings. So all those output tables that I showed you should be presented by you in the findings section with appropriate justification, and that will influence your suggestion and implications of your research. So these are the two sections that get affected by whatsoever has been done by us in part 1 and part 2. So and information to be included in EFA report. So you have to talk about the measured variables that you have been using. So when I say measured variable, what I mean by measured variable is I told you that you have to identify variables that are measurable
Participants, kindly stay connected. Sorry for the inconvenience. Participants, kindly stay connected. The session will be continued after 5 minutes.
Madam? Madam, am I
Ma'am?
audible? Yes, ma'am. Am I audible? Hello? I think I'm not audible. ये दूसरी है वो दूसरी है वो प्रॉब्लम. Hello? Kartika madam, hello. Okay.
Ma'am, we shall
Fine.
continue the session, ma'am.
Just a minute, I'll have to
Ma'am, you're
download the.
audible, ma'am. We shall continue the session, ma'am.
Just a minute, just a minute.
Ma'am, you're audible, ma'am. We shall continue the session, ma'am.
Hello, Kartika ma'am. Am I audible? Kartika ma'am? Okay. Unfortunately, because I'm on a different desktop, I cannot show you the PPT. So I'll just continue about the reporting that has to be done for factor analysis. So the first thing that we have to report is the KMO and Backlist test of sphericity, wherein whatsoever is the table that you get. Based on that, you have to represent the same in your Word document, mentioning that for the factor analysis that was conducted, you have been using a principal component analysis with varimax rotation. So that's the first two things that you have to represent, that what is the method that you have been using and which type of estimation was being done by you. Plus you even need to justify how many variables. For example, I said that I have been using 33 variables. From where have you got those variables? So you even need to represent that in the research methodology section, that I have got these from the literature or from the experts or from industry experts interview and so on. Then you have to represent the KMO and Bartlett's test of sphericity, followed by talking about the total variances explained table. For example, in my case, out of 33 variables, it had given us five different components, if you remember. So I'll be representing it in a table format, plus I'll be writing that there were five components that were extracted from the factor analysis that I had undertaken, and those five variances were explaining 77 percentage of total variances. So that is how I represent with a table below. After the total variances explained table, I have to show the rotated component matrix, because there are five components that are there, but then which components is getting loaded on which factor, or maybe which of those construct is equally important, right? So then if you remember, in the dialog box which was asking me to suppress the table value, I had kept it as less than 0.50. So I'll be reporting that in my research, and I'll be mentioning that all those factors which were having a value more than 0.50 were selected, and these are the factors onto which they are representing. If you look back at the research that is available prior to few years, you would even see that people used to depict the scree plot, which nowadays is not being represented, because that increases the length of the research article that you are writing. So if you wish, you can represent them, or maybe that can be ignored, because that is already getting represented in the table of variances explained. Once you are done with that, you have to show each of those factors, and then which factors have been named by you, what is the name that you have been given to each of the factor also needs to be represented by you. If you have some literature support, or maybe you can also take help of experts to determine the variable name, because that will make your research more concrete. Once you are done with this, you have to represent the limitations, or maybe the future research, as to once you've identified these variables and these variables have been named by you, but then what can be done next with the research is also one of the predominant aspects that has been expected out of a researcher, that can be given at the end in form of the scope of further research, or maybe the implications, or maybe the suggestions for future research. So unfortunately, because I'm not on my desktop, I would not be able to show you the Word documents. But what I can do is, like, I'll be sharing the PPT along with the Word document which has this reporting present in a Word format with the coordination team, and they can circulate it to you. So that's it from my end, and sorry for the technical glitch. If there are any queries, I'm open to handle the Q&A session if there are any. Over to you, ma'am. Kartika, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am. if you have any questions to take up.
Thank you, ma'am. Participants can participants can post their queries in the chat box.
Okay, meanwhile, I would like to draw attention to one aspect. I hope I'm audible. When we are doing this factor analysis, or there can be certain components which are having the loading of less than 0.50. Like in my case, all the 33 items were getting loaded on some or the other factors. But then sometimes it may
Participants,
happen.
if you have any queries, you can post it in the chat box.
So if there are any factors which are having less than that loading, that can be ignored and that also needs to be reported in the research.
The session was so clear and participants have clearly understood the concept. Any action is incomplete without sense of gratitude. Good evening, everyone. I'm very humbled and honored to propose the vote of thanks for this session. I, on behalf of Department of Commerce, extend a hearty vote of thanks to the guest speaker, Dr. Anupama Chirag, for gracefully accepting our invitation to share her wisdom on factor analysis using SPSS. Thank you for making this session in an interactive way, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am. I would like to convey heartfelt thanks to our management members, Dean, Principal, and Head of the departments for their support in the organization of this FDP program. I also thank all the participants for taking part in the program. Once again, thank you all.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Rupa ma'am, and all the people for organizing this and giving me an opportunity. Thank you.